The news from the front was horrible. Clara had read all about it in the Washington papers. Years ago, she had been a school teacher in Oxford, Massachusetts. But some time had passed and Clara had changed careers. Now she was living in Washington, D.C. and working as a government clerk. When Clara heard the reports from the Battle of Bull Run, hundreds dead, many missing, hundreds more, maybe even thousands wounded, she was horrified. The whole country, north and south, had been taken off guard as to the horrors of war. Many, many wounded were brought into the city of Washington, D.C. And as Clara read about the casualties in the papers, her first thought was, what about the boys at the little Texas school? They'd be all grown up now. They'd be of age to be in the Army. Had they been at Bull Run? Were they alive or dead? Clara didn't even know how to begin to search for them. But she decided one of the best ways was to go in person. She volunteered to be a nurse for the Army of the Potomac. But no woman had ever done that kind of work before. A woman following the Army around, tramping through the mud, sleeping in a tent on the ground just like the common foot soldier? It was unheard of. Some of the ladies of Washington, D.C. said very cruel things about Clara. Why, have you heard what that Clara Barton wants to do? I heard she wants to ride a horse straddle-legged like a man and go trolloping after those soldiers. I just don't think nice ladies do that. Clara didn't care what people said. She wanted to help. She wanted to be there to relieve soldiers' suffering. She wanted to be a battlefield nurse. She asked the authorities, but they said no. She asked again, and they again said no. She kept asking until finally she wore them down and the War Department gave Clara special permission to follow the Army of the Potomac. There were rules. She would strictly be a volunteer, no pay. If anyone helped her, she would have to recruit helpers. They weren't going to assign any Army personnel to her. But Clara was glad to go. Clara had collected lots and lots of supplies preparing for her first trip to the front following the soldiers. She had collected jars of fruit. She had collected big boxes of hard crackers called hardtack, sacks of coffee. She had all this loaded into a train car and had it sent ahead. She knew where to send it, to the same valley, Bull Run. The armies were coming together again, nearly in that same spot, only this time Clara would be there to make a difference. When she arrived by horse and wagon, Clara was very saddened to learn that the battle had already been raging for several days, and there were many wounded, already in desperate need of help. She rounded a big bend in the road, and there before her, spread out in a field of hay, were 3,000 wounded Union troops. They had been laying there for days. Clara learned they hadn't been fed. They hadn't even been given water. Clara knew exactly what to do to begin. She would give everyone something to eat and drink, and then she would dress their wounds. She ran to the rail car, which was parked on a side track. The railroad was very near that place, and she pulled out some supplies and quickly built a campfire. And then she realized she hadn't brought anything to cook in. Clara had never been camping, and she had never been part of the Army. She'd never been a battlefield nurse. She was horribly unprepared. She rummaged around until she found an old dented kettle, and she set it over the hot coals, and she would cook for 3,000 men from that one little pot. She opened up jars of peaches and dumped the peaches into the kettle. She followed that with cracked up hard crackers, and then she poured coffee in on top of everything else and stirred it together until she had made a thick gruel. It looked awful, probably tasted worse. But when Clara started handing it out in little tin cups and old dented plates that she found laying around, the men seemed as grateful as if they were eating a fine French cuisine meal. They were so hungry they were glad for anything. Clara worked all that day and all through the night, all the next day and all through the second night, and all through a third day and into the night. She had worked for 3 days and nights without stopping, but she was determined that those men would be fed, and she did it. Just as she had finished feeding the last of the men, Army personnel came, and a train pulled onto the sidetrack near the hayfield, and the men were carried to the train and steamed off to Washington, D.C., where they could get proper medical attention. And then a man came riding up to Clara on a big horse, and he said that the battle had shifted, and it was now in the little village of Chantilly. There were many wounded. The work she was doing was already news throughout many units of the army. Could she come and help? Ah, Clara was thrilled to be needed. Yes, she would come. She jumped into her wagon, and she started off down the road toward the battlefield, right into the little town of Chantilly. When Clara arrived at the little village of Chantilly, she realized she could not have wounded just thrown helter-skelter into a big field of hay. You couldn't tell who was in most need of help. She would have to organize things. She pulled her wagon across the road, and as wounded were brought from the fighting, she would stop each wagon, climb over the wheel, and check the man in the back of the wagon. Sometimes someone only had a broken arm or a broken leg. Very painful, no doubt, but it wasn't life-threatening. She would set them off to the side of the road and have them wait a while. If someone came with a bullet wound or she saw blood, she would move them ahead in the line. They needed to see a surgeon right away. They had a life-threatening wound. A wagon rolled up from the battlefield. There was no one in it except a young boy sitting on the back of the wagon. He was swinging his feet. Clara asked him what was wrong. "Your stomach hurts." "My stomach hurts too. Look around you and see this suffering. Of course your stomach hurts. Now get off of this wagon and go back where you came from." Clara was not going to stand for nonsense like that. She was only interested in helping people who truly needed her help. Another wagon rolled up. There was a man stretched out in the back of the wagon. His face was so covered in mud, Clara could hardly see his eyes. She needed a cloth to wipe the mud from his face, but she didn't have one. She reached down and grabbed the hem of her skirt, picked it up and stuck it in her mouth and chewed on her dress until it was wet with her own saliva, and then she wiped the man's face. As soon as she got his face cleaned up, she could see his lips moving. But they were so still, hardly moving at all. She put her ear right down to the man's mouth so she could hear what he was saying. The words were just barely audible. Finally, she heard the man say, "I know you. Don't you know me? I carried your books at Little Texas Schoolhouse. You taught me how to hit a baseball." It was Peter Bailey. Clara could see by the wound in his arm that Peter probably would not be able to use his arm to carry books or play baseball anymore. She bandaged his arm and made sure that he was on a train headed for Washington, D.C. She would later learn that Peter died. As the war drug on, Clara learned from her mistakes. If she had learned anything at the Second Battle of Bull Run and at the battle that immediately followed in the village of Chantilly, she had learned that she had to be well supplied. Now she traveled with a huge wagon packed full of everything she might need: food, bandages, medications, even magazines and newspapers for wounded soldiers to read while they waited for medical attention. She traveled with anything and everything. Her wagon was always swaying and rocking from side to side, so filled with supplies. The army was very grateful for her help. She was no longer made fun of, and people did not talk about her. They were speaking about her as if she were a great heroine. The army wanted her to come to the Battle of Antietam. Fighting had been raging for days. They were desperate for supplies. In fact, when Clara came, she found that the soldiers had moved into an old farmhouse. They were using it as a field hospital. Just across a cornfield from that place, you could hear the cannons booming so close by. Clara rolled up into the yard, and one of the army surgeons was sitting on the front steps of the farmhouse, his face in his hands, and he was crying so hard you could see the tears trickling down the backs of his hands, running down his forearms, and dripping off his elbows. When Clara asked him what on earth was wrong, he pointed to a little stub of a candle that was sitting in the windowsill of the house, and he explained that that was the only light that he had. And when the sunlight failed that evening, and that little candle burned out, he would not be able to see to perform surgeries, and men would die by the hundreds even overnight. Clara smiled. The doctor wondered why she was smiling at such a serious situation. And she said, "Well, if I've learned anything, sir, I have learned you have to be well supplied. I have lanterns." "How many lanterns do you have?" "Well, let's see, I brought 2 cases. That's 24 lanterns, and I have enough fuel to keep them going for at least 3 days. The doctor was so thrilled, he leaped off the steps and gave Clara such a hug, she thought her head would pop off her shoulders. They ran and grabbed lanterns and filled them with kerosene, and then they went into the house and hung them from hooks on the ceiling and went right to work. Clara became the nurse for the surgeon. She would assist him. The work was grisly. Arms and legs had to be amputated, bullets had to be extracted. It was very terrible, but Clara tried not to think about it. She just concentrated on helping these men become well. Her main job was to hold a big blanket over top of the patient. When the cannons would boom, the whole house would shake and ceiling plaster would fall from the ceiling and land on the man who was stretched out on the kitchen table. And so Clara would catch the ceiling plaster in her blanket and throw it off on the floor to keep the man from suffering any more than he already was suffering. Clara worked until the early hours of the morning. By now her back was hurting, her arms were sore. She was very pale and starting to sway back and forth a little bit. The doctor was afraid she might faint. And so they took a bit of a break from their work, and the doctor told her to go outside and get some fresh air. When Clara walked outside, she could see the corn across from the house shimmering and trembling from the booming of the cannons and the earth shaking beneath the corn stalks. And out of that shimmering corn stumbled a fellow. He was wearing the blue uniform of a Union soldier. He had his hand clapped up over his eye. He walked right for Clara Barton and he said, "Ma'am, something's burning my face awful bad. I don't have a looking glass. I can't tell what it is. Can you help me?" Clara reached up and pulled his hand away from his face and was horrified to see a little bullet hole in his cheekbone. You could see smoke coming out of his face. He had just been struck with a bullet and he was lucky to not have been killed. When Clara explained what was wrong, he said, "Oh, you got to get it out. You got to get it out right now. It burns like fire." "Oh, yes," said Clara. "Come with me and I'll help you to the front of the line to see the surgeon." "Oh, no, ma'am. I got to go back to my men. They need me. Here, you can do it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own pocket knife and clicked it open. Clara's hand started to tremble. "I'm just a volunteer nurse. I don't think I can do this." "You've got to do it, ma'am." The man held his head against a tree trunk so he could keep it as still as possible. Clara breathed a prayer and then thrust the point of the knife into the bullet hole. With one quick flick, she was able to pop the lead ball right out of his cheekbone. She saw it bounce into the ground. The man scooped it up and put it into his pocket. He said he wanted to keep it as a souvenir. She gave him a little antiseptic. He wrapped his face in a bandage, and he turned around and walked right back into the cornfield. After the raging battle had ceased, Clara walked the path through the corn. She wanted to see where those cannons were located. She wanted to see what the soldiers had seen. For nearly a mile, you could not see the grass or the dirt or any plants for all of the bodies laying on that field. These were the remains of who knows how many men who never even made it to see the surgeon in the field hospital. Clara was horrified. She needed help. She had helped many people, but if she had a crew, she could help so many more. Clara returned to Washington, D.C. and asked if she could have helpers to go with her. She needed personnel. Absolutely not. When Clara asked the Army officials if she could have a crew to travel with her, they said it was impossible. Every man was needed for fighting. But when Clara explained that if you did not provide medical attention, then people were going to die and there would be fewer and fewer people for fighting, they started to see reason. At last, they gave Clara a small crew. Several men who would work with her. They would each drive a mule team and a supply wagon. This would help tremendously. Clara was grateful for anything the Army could do. She was called to Fredericksburg, a little village, lots of wounded. She was much needed. And when she put her crew together and asked them to go, they were determined to ruin her work. These men had never worked for a woman before, and they weren't about to start now. They were not going to take orders from a school teacher. Clara said they needed to go down the road and then turn onto the left side at the fork. And so the men would go and turn to the right just to spite her. If she asked them to hurry the mules and make them go faster, they would stop the animals and just stand in the road, full of obstinates. If she asked them to let the animals rest a bit, then they would whip the mules and take off running. All day long it was a vexation. Whatever Clara asked, they did exactly the opposite. And after a long, frustrating journey, they arrived across the river from the little town of Fredericksburg. It was too late to help on this day, and so Clara pitched her tent, started a cooking fire, got into the wagon, and got out some of her best supplies: fresh farm eggs, some salted bacon. She mixed a pan of biscuits. After she'd cooked everything, she put all the food out onto tin plates and called her crew, and they all sat down and they ate. When the men had finished eating, they lit pipes and sat around the fire and smoked for a while, and Clara washed all the dishes and put all the cooking supplies away by herself, and then she sat on a camp stool a little bit removed from the men and listened to their conversation. After it grew rather late, the men stood up and stretched out and said they were walking off to their tents, and just before they left, Clara jumped up from her stool and thrust her little hand forward and said, "Gentlemen, I know it was difficult working for a woman, and you've never taken orders from a school teacher before, but I'm grateful for your help. I think tomorrow we'll be able to accomplish much good, and I just wanted to shake your hand and say thank you." And then Clara would squeeze down. Clara wrote years later in an article about this situation that when she shook hands with the last man, she could see tears trickling down his cheeks. She never did know if that was from the horrible embarrassment or if he was suffering pain from her good, firm handshake. But in the morning, it was a completely different situation. When Clara walked out of her tent, there were all the men waiting patiently for her. They were dressed in their uniforms, clean shaven, ready for work. One of the men stepped forward and said, "Miss Barton, I just wanted to speak on behalf of our group and apologize. We hated working for a woman, and we meant to wreck your whole operation. And you didn't yell at us or get even angry. You just treated us like we were kings. You've fed us one of the finest meals we've had in months, and that shamed us. And we're sorry. And we'll do right by you from now on." Those men were as good as their word. Clara said she never had to wash another dish. They would always say, "Oh no, Miss Barton, why don't you rest right over here and let us do that dirty work?" They didn't want her to get in harm's way. She could see that there were wounded just across the river in Fredericksburg, and she wanted to go to them. Bullets flying back and forth, the cannon fire, and the men said, "Oh no, Miss Barton, it's too dangerous. You let us go and we'll bring the wounded back to you." They even tried to hold their hands out and hold her back, but Clara would say, "No, I'm a nurse. That's what I do. I have to go to the wounded." And she darted right under their hands and took off running for the river. She was so fast, fleet as a deer, they couldn't even catch her. She ran down to a pontoon bridge, jumped onto the bridge, and started across. Bullets were whizzing so close to her head, she could feel the hot wind on her hair. When she got to the other side, a man reached his arm out and helped her ashore. A cannonball whizzed right between them and exploded. It ripped the sleeve off of his jacket and tore a hole in her skirt. As soon as Clara realized the man was unharmed, she ran right up onto the battlefield and started dragging wounded out of harm's way. Later that night, as Clara walked from cot to cot checking on soldiers, one of the men leaned up on his elbow and he said, "Miss Barton, I know this sounds awfully strange, but as you walk about our campsite, your long skirt seems kind of sparkly like." What a strange thing to say. At first, Clara thought the man might be suffering delirium from the battle. And then it dawned on her. She walked over to a campfire and stood in front of its light and fanned out her big skirts. There were bullet holes in the fabric where she had run across the pontoon bridge. Soldiers gathered around and they started to count the bullet holes. My goodness, there were 30 bullet holes in her dress, and not a single lead ball had struck her in the leg or the knee. "Miss Barton? Miss Barton, aren't you scared?" the men said. No, said Clara. I feel that I am the most well-protected woman in all of the United States. But Miss Barton, you could have been killed. Yet, I was unharmed. Miss Barton, that's like a miracle. Are you an angel? No, said Clara. I'm just a volunteer school teacher from Oxford, Massachusetts. But the nickname stuck. Forever afterward, Union soldiers would call Clara the angel of the battlefield.